You're listening to the Primal Happiness Show, a podcast dedicated to helping you thrive in this crazy modern world. Every Tuesday, we explore the nature of how our minds really work, what exactly the human animal requires to thrive, and how we can live happier and more fulfilling lives. If you're new here and haven't yet taken our free class, then there's no better place to get a jump start on reclaiming your primal happiness. It's where we'll guide you step by step through our antidote to today's modern world. Simply head on over to primalhappiness.co/antidote to get the free class and discover how to thrive without having to move to a planet that's not so crazy as ours. But now, your host, Leanne Brook-Tyler.
Hello, my beautiful people. A huge warm welcome back to the show. In today's crazy modern world, men and women are living shallow, disconnected, and unfulfilling lives. So we created the path for those who are ready to reclaim their wildness and actualize their deepest gifts. So I think, I could be wrong, but I think last week I was sharing that we were, I think, a week or less than a week into Unraveling the Body, and it was just blowing me away how gorgeous and deep it was going. And that's still the case the next week on. But I think I said last week that I suddenly realised we have nothing else to offer at the moment. We don't have any other programs that we have dates for. We haven't got anything kind of open to sign up to. Even our one-to-one work is largely fully booked. So it's so funny that was a week ago. And then yesterday, I think it was, Jonathan and I were planning out what we would like to create over the next year, and which is lots and lots of really amazing things. And one of the offerings that's been kind of bubbling around in the background for a while, Waking the Wild Heart. The name kind of came up before we really had much else that, attached to it. We didn't really know the details. That kind of, we just knew we wanted to do something around relationships, love, intimacy, polarity. And then that name just kind of came to mind. And so we just sort of put it on the back burner. We'll do something about that at some point. And then when we had the conversation yesterday, it was clear that Waking the Wild Heart wants to be birthed, and quite soon. So I don't yet have any kind of details I can send you or anything like that, but it looks as though that's going to be happening at the end of June, possibly beginning of July. It will be a limited number of spaces, maybe about 10. It's going to be the first co-led and co-ed creation that Jonathan and I have done together for many years. So it's going to be for both men and women, couples and singles, and led by the pair of us. And it's going to be, oh my goodness, just magical, just magical. I can already feel it without even knowing exactly what we're going to get into. I am already feeling so excited. So, like I say, I don't have any details I can send you to. If you know that's for you, I mean, places will go really fast. I've already got people who've contacted me saying, I want this, I want this, I want this, before I've even had any details. So if you're listening and you definitely want in, drop us an email and I'll make sure we come to you first, or just listen out, and hoping in the next week we'll have some more details. But yeah, very excited about that. And now, talking of wild hearts, this week's show is with an incredible woman who is all about wildness and Eros. And it's Kate Joyner. And Kate is a nature-based soul guide, deep feminine facilitator, and experimental actress, guiding the way for the remembrance of Eros as the antidotal medicine for our troubled times. Her work echoes the call of an elemental need for initiatory pathways that allow us to come into intimate relationship with body, earth, and soul so we can create a culture seeded in wildness and love. Her passion for the revolution seeps into all her offerings, be it through her mentorships, women's journeys, theatre shows, or her poetic immersions. You'll be brought to the life that lies on the edge where the magic happens. So you've probably got a very good sense that this is Oh, an amazing woman, amazing work, and it's going to be an amazing episode. So in this show, we spoke about descending to the soul versus ascension to spirit, which is something you've probably heard me talk about many, many times on the show before, and is very much baked into how Kate sees things and Kate's work too. So we talked quite a bit about that. We talked about the sacred wound and how in this culture we'll typically pathologise our conditions rather than see them as an invitation into myth and soul. So yes, this was a gorgeously deep episode. I loved it. Let's jump in. Hello, Kate. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. And thank you as well for being so patient while I've been sorting out the multiple forms of chaos, dog-related, tech-related, and everything before we could even start recording. I very much appreciate it. So we are talking about, I think, one of the probably like deepest topics that's possible to talk about, actually. And I love that when we spoke last time, when we were preparing to have this conversation, you were saying your work really kind of the deepest point of your work is around the sacred wound. And I remember at the time, that was probably a week or two ago, wasn't it, that we had that conversation? And at the time, I said, I feel like we might need to kind of meander there slowly. It feels like quite a lot to just hit listeners with out of the blue. And I don't know what shifted since then, but I kind of feel like I'm actually more, I think we'll still meander there in a way, but I feel like I'm just happy to, go there quite directly, actually. And it feels increasingly like, and I'd be interested to know your take on this, it feels like the rupture of our way of life that's been created by this time has made this something that just feels like it's been raised to the surface a bit more as something that people are being called to. And I think even a week or two ago when we had that conversation, I was thinking, I don't know how relevant or how interesting this will feel to listeners. Where I feel like now, actually, do you know what? I think this sense of this deep wound that we've got and the medicine that's held there is something more and more of us becoming present to in this time. So I'd love to know your thoughts on that. But perhaps before we go to there, I would just love to know your sense anyway of like, how did you arrive at this work? What's made you passionate about it?
Yeah, well, I guess the sacred wound work is an aspect of my work, and it's kind of held in the larger context of the deep feminine, nature-based soul initiation and experimental theatre work. So for me, the sacred wound, the core wound to sacred wound journey is part of the soul journey. And this is an elemental part of my work. And then the soul journey has many different phases. So I kind of accompany various people through different phases of their soul journey, depending on how and when they arrive. So this has really been a big unraveling for me. I kind of started out as a Gestalt psychotherapist and then trained in shamanic as a shamanic practitioner. And then I, in 2012, got interested in eco-psychology and simultaneously did an initiation into the deep feminine during that year. And so I started to see the parallels between what was happening to women's body and Earth's body. And then got interested in the work of Bill Plotkin and have been apprenticing with Bill for the last 6 years. And I'm now a guide for them, for the Animus Valley Institute. And part of that journey, I also went and took the deep listening that I, that in the form of poetry that was coming to me from my deep conversation with nature and my soul. I took all of this poetry into into a experimental theatre laboratory, and have trained as an experimental actress. And so for me, it's just kind of been this, my own personal journey of my own unraveling. And then I've also been in this deep apprenticeship. So the core wound, sacred wound work has been very much a part of coming to know the deep mythos of my life, coming to know how this particular wound is a gift in terms of how it holds the keys to my deeper destiny, and how it holds the medicine that I'm here to offer to the world. So and so it's like that is part of the journey in the context of the wider journey. It's kind of like when we're ready to go in and do that deep work, or when we get called to go and do that deep work, then the mystery of that kind of reveals itself to us. So that's kind of a little bit how my journey has overlapped with my apprenticeships and my own understanding of how it's woven into the structure of the soul journey, to the deep structure. Yeah.
Yeah, what a gorgeous journey. Would you mind sharing a sense of kind of what that personal journey has been for you in terms of your core wound and what that's revealed?
Yeah, it's kind of like the mythos, it's the pathos to mythos. I was thinking about this also today. So we can how do you say that word? We can make everything like a pathology. We can make everything like it's a neurosis, or it's kind of stemmed in a problem. And, at some point of our healing journey, we are, we have to kind of look at the deep unconscious and look at the patterns and look at the ways in which our conditioning and our beliefs kind of hold us in a particular way of life that's too small. And then at some point, and then we have to do the necessary healing. And then at some point there's the opportunity to really dive into the deep mythological structure of that patterning and that wounding. And then when we can allow that alchemical process to happen, it's kind of like the deep medicine of that wound reveals itself to us. So and then it goes from the pathos to the mythos.
Oh wow, I love the way you said that. Yeah, so it kind of goes from problem to a quest,
right? Or it's like a problem, or to the deeper kind of wider archetypal structure that's holding us within the lens of this particular walk of life that we've all been given. Like everybody's is unique, so it's a particular way. And if we pathologize everything, that's how you say it.
I was going to jump in and help you, and I said, you know what, I think I'm going to do that and then go down the same route as you are. There's a kind of a bit of the word, maybe go down the wrong.
Yeah, if we pathologize everything, then we're kind of keeping ourselves away from the deeper mystery of what's at play, because the pathology comes from a structure that's based in our cultural lens. And so it kind of inhibits us to a certain way of seeing things. And whilst there are necessary steps of healing and holding that are part of that journey, but then if we stay in the pathology, then we're reducing the deep structure of our lives to a cage, to a way of being that is related to a culture that has lost touch with the deeper mystery and the deeper archetypal patterning and the gods and the forces of nature and the mystical whispers and all of these things, the magical essence, the mythological, the archetypal, the deep-rooted earth kind of language and unraveling. So that's a great tragedy if it stays in the pathology.
Yeah, I can really feel that. It feels in a way that there's a cultural sense of, and I think in some ways this has kind of shifted perhaps into a more whole or healthy way of looking at it, where we recognize there can be some utility in healing. But if we're only looking at it still through that lens of here's a problem, if I do the healing to fix it, it's no longer a problem. We're missing the shift into a completely different land and what's available to us from there.
Yeah, I love that it's a completely different land, because as we're talking, I'm just reminded of James Hillman, and he speaks a lot about this. And one of his books, something like 100 Years of Psychotherapy in the World, is still, that's not the exact title, but the world is still, going off rail or something like that. And he talks, about really if we pathologize everything and then we try and adapt our pathology so we become healthy citizens of a culture that its roots is pathological, is then we're adapting ourselves to a system that its root is anti-life. So for me, the deep essence, the deep funk, the deep calling of any kind of soul journey is that it's personal, but it's also political, in that it creates the social change. We're in a culture that is very anti-life, that's destroying the planet moment by moment, and has very dire humanitarian effects on who we are as beings in the world. There's no soul in our culture. We've completely lost it. So that the pathology is at the root of our current dominant culture. And so if we are creating healing modalities that are adapting us to the dysfunction of a distorted culture, then there's no that's in itself is a big pathology. So if we and there is necessary healthy healing that we need to do on our journey, so that we can then descend into the deep mythos, which is about coming back into alignment with the earth and the medicine that we carry in order to create the social change, in order to create systems that are at its roots pro-life.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. This might be a bit tangential, but I was thinking how our culture is anti-life in two different ways. One is, as we are talking about it here, like how life shows up in our bodies, in nature. But then there is a kind of another way that we reject this, where we kind of go full into what you could call kind of spirituality and the kind of dismissing of life here in this realm, in these bodies. And both of them are, although it may seem that kind of like leap into spirituality is more beneficial than, for example, being the anti-life that you were just talking about, both of them are kind of really missing that opportunity of being like experiencing deeply what's possible from just like being fully in the experience of life and in the gift of life, rather than it being this kind of fixing and operating and managing at the surface level that's been so trained into us by this culture. Right.
And that's also another part of my work is, and I hear you speaking of that, I hear the deep, it's really like the feminine principle, the descent into matter. It's the descent into body. It's the animality. It's the instinct. It's the full-bodied aliveness, the full-bodied eros of life, which isn't about one half of our experience, but the totality of our experience. So for me, that's that's the part that's missing is really the deep shadow work and the descent into the underworld. We have a very upper world orientated spirituality, like the East, the yoga, the meditation, transcend the body, transcend the mind, and what about descending? What about coming into relationship to this exquisite, sensitivity and aliveness and instinctual, animal, primal, wild, clawing, through the forest, smelling, tasting, this kind of, full-bodied yes to life. This is really the path that is less well known and less trodden in our culture, and is fundamentally necessary, is needed right now.
Yeah.
To establish a rebalance.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And we take that journey personally, but recognize the ripple of that medicine is cultural. It's
right.
revolutionary.
Right.
So would you be able to give an example, and that could either be your personal example or perhaps someone that you've worked with, obviously, confidential, of what that could look like in terms of something that we're pathologizing, I managed to say it, and how we can then shift into this way of descending into the myth available and the medicine that's available when we do so.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something, as in anything on the soul journey, it's not really something that we get to choose. It's like not one day we're sitting there and go, oh, you know what, actually, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this a different way. It's kind of, the way that mystery reveals. It's like it's kind of like through my work with Bill Plotkin and the Animus Valley Institute, it's like the revelation of the mystery unfolding. And it's like us making ourselves available and susceptible to that unfolding. So, through the model of the soul initiation journey, in the first half of our lives, before we go through soul initiation, our ego is in service of our soul. Our soul is in service of our ego, in that it is constantly trying to get us to awaken. And this can happen through crises, through events, through breakdowns, through losses, through deaths, all of these things. Until we're really ready to go, okay, there's nothing left for me to hold on to. I've been totally stripped down to the core. Everything, I'm ready to give up everything that I've ever known about my life and just wander into the deeper mystery of my life. And so that is, and not many people necessarily get to that point, or people might get to that point, but not necessarily heed that call. It's kind of like a calling. It's kind of like an existential kind of quest. And because there's not really any context for it in our culture, people often think that there's something wrong with them, so they go to a therapist, and then they try and, the therapist will go, oh no, it's okay, everything, you have everything that you need. Look, you've got a nice house, you've got a nice car, you've got a good job, all of these things. But spiritually, on the underneath, there's no connection to soul. And so there's a certain kind of deadness, and there's no deep fulfillment or purpose in that place. But people, and so it manifests existentially as like this crisis, and people, become quite lost and quite confused because they've worked all of their lives to get to this point, to get what they think they needed and what they think they should have, but it's still experiencing these feelings of emptiness. So without the context of the soul initiation journey, that's a problem. But in the context of a soul initiation journey, that would be the calling, where you're just ready to leave the life that you've known and go in search of the life that is yours to live. And that includes a leaving home and a quest, and leaving home can happen metaphorically, if you have children, and there's ways in which you just retract from your normal everyday world as much as possible, but you still have the responsibility of your children. And that's one of the deep sacred contracts that is sacred. That can't be changed. But there are, it's like the metaphorical. If I went on this when I heard the call. I went physically. I left everything, and I went to the States. And if you can't do that, if you can't physically go off and wander, it's like you can do that metaphorically. But this isn't something that we get to decide. This is something that is it happens to us. And I think the most important thing here to recognize is that when that calling happens, that's a calling to descend into the mysteries, and there's nothing wrong with that. And that needs to be recontextualized, because so many people experience that, go to therapy, try and get it fixed, and then they stay in this life that is away from the depths of their soul.
Oh my goodness, yeah, I love that so much. It's I was just pondering on my own journey, where I definitely had that rupture and call when I lost my father 8 years ago. And it's hard to know really why. At the time, I didn't have any of the context of this. And I can see when I kind of look back with hindsight that a couple of things happened. One, just because of the circumstances surrounding his death, it wasn't really possible to just kind of like operate over the top of it and go back to normal life. There were like a number of reasons where it just kind of like took us all into this kind of like life had broken up, and there just wasn't the normal way of being able to operate that made sense anymore. And so I then don't really know why I look back now and I think I was so fortunate, because it was kind of like a new way of being was created for me in that year. And then what I find interesting is I then, a year later, I had a kind of call into more like the ascension path, into spirituality. So I spent a number of years going that route. And then it's really been the last few years that I've been called into a kind of more of a soul journey. And so I'm kind of looking at through the frame of what you've just said here, and thought, I suppose a combination of things. One, why? Maybe I was just lucky, one of the like lucky ones in a way, but then I think maybe I wasn't lucky, because perhaps I could have had that kind of call to the soul earlier had I known that was available. But I think for whatever reason, my experience didn't feel uncomfortable in the way that I kind of then needed to go seek help. There was a real shift that happened for me, but it didn't feel like something I needed to fix. So I think I was quite fortunate in that I kind of didn't then go and like make better something that actually wasn't a problem. The other thing that occurs to me is that that path that I then took into spirituality, I think that's what I often do see. It's like, again, we look as a culture, we don't have that narrative of there being any possibility of a descent to the soul. And so I think what we do is we're trying to look, like I was trying to make sense of like, what is this I've woken up to? Let's try and make sense of my experience. Then came across the kind of spiritual path I then took, and it was like, oh, this is what I've been looking for. This answers the questions. And so that's what I often see. It's kind of like if people do use those ruptures as some kind of form of awakening, it tends to go that way rather than into a descent. There's not really a question there. I just want to kind of share that with you. And if you've got anything to illuminate on that, I'd love to know what you think.
Yeah, I think it's I think the rupture and the ascension path that you're kind of talking about and is, it's the spiritual awakening. So again, referring to Bill's models, which he's, spent last 20, 30 years mapping out. And so they're very well, and this is part of his genius, is his map making. And so, he talks in one of his books, he has the developmental wheel of the soul. And so one of those, the necessary phases is, the spiritual awakening, where you come out of I'm the center of the universe, kind of like the egocentric orientation to life, to a spiritual, where you have a spiritual awakening, where you can have this opening and you realize that you're part of something much, much, much bigger. And that he would call like an eco awakening. And so you kind of get a sense that you're part of this universe and part of this cosmos. And that's a necessary part of the human development of the psyche and of the soul is, awakening. And that can happen through crisis, and it can happen through many, many different ways. And then, as well for me, it also happened losing my dad. I lost my dad at a very young age when I was 19. And that opened, that was the portal opening to another, to this whole unraveling, essentially. And then once we've kind of, and then the eco awakening is a necessary part, and much great things and works and actions in the world are established from an eco awakened perspective and orientation to the world. And then the descent into the mystery, the descent into the soul comes when we're ready to. It comes after that. It comes when it's just like, okay, I've got everything that I need. Life doesn't make sense. It's like that really deep existential kind of, there's something more here. I need to go down. I need to find what that is. So this orientation towards, another thing that Bill also talks about is the upper world spirituality, which is all the love and the oneness. And that's a necessary part of our orientation as well. So we're made up of the upper, middle, and lower worlds. And, we have context for the middle, and it's widely referenced in our culture, the upper world spirituality, the all oneness, the unconditional love. And then there's not many schools of thought or models that really allow us to embrace the underworld. And that's also a necessary part of our of coming into to becoming a complete human being, is rooting ourselves in the underworld as well as the middle and the upper.
Yeah. Yes. I really love that. What I notice can happen, and again, I think so much of this is because the cultural narrative doesn't include the descent. But a number of the people that will come and work with me, which are primarily women, have usually come from some form of spirituality. And I notice there is a kind of, they're feeling the call to something else, and yet there can be quite a reluctance, because it's kind of, that was at one point the like, oh my goodness, I found the answer. This feels so much better than life before I had the upper world. And oh my goodness, if I explore anything else, am I going to have to give that up? And then I might go back to where I was before that. And so I really noticed there's some real fear driven up by the idea that there could be something else. There could be another journey worth taking, because it could mean giving up that hard-won sense of, as you say, oneness, love. I think that can be quite scary, and particularly because firstly, that kind of descent to the soul isn't just something that we culturally know and talk about, but also I think because it's kind of descent and dark, and it's not made up of this kind of like, love and light and all singing, all dancing, it's going to be easy. And so I don't know if you maybe don't have it through quite the same lens as I experience it with clients, but I really notice there's this kind of like, I don't almost want to believe there is this descent of the soul that kind of can or needs to happen. So I'd love you to talk about this, because I think there's a number of listeners to this show that will find what you say on this quite illuminating.
Yeah. I think it's kind of like looking at in terms of the four directions, like the East and the West. The East is kind of like the more transcendent bliss orientation. In the West is the real kind of dark, more shamanic, more earthy, more of the shadow realm. And some people are really well orientated to that westerly way of being in the world. I'm a very Westy person. I've always loved delving into the depth of the unconscious and doing shadow, and have found it very hard to be in spaces where the West isn't, the more shadow realms isn't acknowledged or given space, where it is just, this perpetual light. And so for me, when I came across the Descent to the Soul, it was just like a massive sigh of relief. I was just like, oh,
I'm
hallelujah. Like, yeah, exactly. Like, where have you been all my life? And actually, the more that I've traversed and gone down and delved deeply into my shadow, the more of myself has become available to me, and the more kind of this deep erotic connection to life is if I can embrace the fullness of who I am, if I'm not scared to embrace my darkness as well as my light also, then I'm totally available to the fullness of life. If we're only available to the light and the nice and the pretty and the good feelings, we're missing, one part of our human existence that is fundamentally brings us into fullness and aliveness. And so I think it's really, when we first come across the darkness, or, what's been seems dark, it can be a bit like, whoa, this can be a bit scary. But the more that you become resourced, I think one of the key things here is having the resources to be able to navigate, which is, you can't go into the underworld without a well-resourced psyche, without having done sufficient healing and having a resource psyche. So once that ground has been established, then it's just like, oh wow, like the most enlivening embrace, like even the grief and the rage and all of the feelings and the beings that you encounter down there. It's like, it just brings you closer to the fullness of life. So for me, it's become a deeply embodied, erotic, full love affair, essentially.
It's so funny. What you've just said is so similar to some things I just said on a call this morning with a woman who wanted to explore potentially working with me, and she's from a Tony Robbins background, and her kind of the focus there is very much kind of maintaining these kind of positive states. And it can look like, why the hell would you give that up? Why would you want to experience anything but these lovely positive states? And my reply was so similar, like in some places word for word to what you've just said. And I think that's, again, something so missing from our kind of cultural narrative, that there would be meaning and beauty and fullness to have that full experience. And without having that sense of a kind of map that includes that, why would you choose into it?
Right. And, I think this goes back a little bit to what we talked about at the beginning of the conversation about the cultural orientation, that it's just the way that we see things through the way that we've been taught or conditioned that life actually is. But, and we haven't been given the skills to really navigate these deep feeling realms, which are so deeply of the feminine, and we've become scared, and it's been kind of this repressed and taboo side of our humanity that the women. I'm just thinking about the women who used to be locked away in mental institutions for hysteria, and it's this deep capacity for feeling and but the skill. It's like I'm wanting to write something at the moment about the art of the feminine. Like, to do the feminine well is an art. It's an absolute art. Like, you have to learn the skills to be able to navigate the realm of the feminine. It's not something that we're taught, and we're not. And our whole culture has repressed that side of our humanity. And so to be able to come into full relationship with it and do it and embrace the fullness of both the light and the dark experiences of our life, which aren't necessarily polarized in that way. It's just the way that we perceive them. We have to learn. We have to resource ourselves and learn new capacities that are outside of our current cultural context. And then once we have that, then it's just that, wow, you can embrace, you can throw yourself into life and embrace life and take risks and do the things that you never dared to do and say the things that you never dared to say and show up in the ways that, because you can embrace the totality. So it's opening yourself to the fullness of life. That's how I see that journey.
Yeah. What just occurred to me listening to you say that was how I think there's a growing appetite for more expression. Sometimes words like authenticity are used. I'm reading the book Untamed by Glennon Doyle at the moment, and there's a lot in there I love about kind of, it's called Untamed because it's about being wild. And then there's a point at which, how can I name this? It feels as though, in a way, that it's a call to greater expression, wildness, not people pleasing, which is wonderful. But I think without that, like grounding, that rooting into this like fertile soil of the feminine, like that's part of what resource you and hold you and carry you into that greater reveal, greater expression. And so I think it can feel quite harsh, actually. That's what I notice in conversations with women in particular that I have, is this sense of like, almost like I should be more, I should be people pleasing yet less. I should be more authentic. I should be freer. It feels like quite a harsh, scary call without that kind of supporting depth that allows us to feel safe and feel held and guided as we are in that reveal, as we're in that uncovering. I'd love to know what you think about that.
Yeah, as you're speaking, I just, having the image of, our sense of belonging, is how to take risks of wildness if we're not rooted in the wildness, if we don't know our place within the wildness. That is,
which includes our bodies.
It includes our bodies, and it includes our relationship to the natural world, like through, it's like it's the soul journey, coming to know our ecological niche. That's how Bill describes soul, is that roots us in our ecological place within the wild world. Yeah. And so without that, we can't really be wild, because we're rooted in a culture that isn't that. We're rooted in a culture that is about conforming and about people pleasing and about, selling your soul to keep the clogs of a machine going, essentially. So without that other orientation and into the roots of the earth, into the true belonging of earth, and that's going to be very difficult to be able to take those steps authentically, and for that to feel, like it's in service of yourself and in service of the larger good.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that's a conversation, and it's no surprise, but it's not a conversation that's not often had. And it's no surprise, but because the whole awareness of that possibility is missing from our culture. So it's kind of, there's this surface level call without a sense of like what actually it would take to be able to create that.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm really glad that we're talking about this here. Even as we're talking about it, I'm kind of seeing that more clearly than I had before. And it's interesting, actually, because the two observations that I'd made about, or either I'd made or actually one of my clients made to me was, I'm kind of sounding like I'm picking on Glennon Doyle, and I actually love the book. But the two areas that there's a clear disconnect with is her body and her connection to the wild. And so it's no surprise, like it is literally exactly what we're talking about here, even though so much of what she's saying is really helpful and true and kind of the right direction. She personally lacks that. So it's no wonder that what she's pointing at lacks that. So yeah, really helpful thing to pull into the light. So how are we doing for time? So we're almost out. I'm really enjoying this conversation. So I could definitely spend ages just carrying on meandering around here. But to, I guess, make this into I guess something that is an invitation or a kind of like a breadcrumb along this path. How would you think it would be a useful place to leave this for listeners? Like what would be a helpful place for them to go next, or to take heed of, or to listen to?
Well, I mean, that's so broad because it really just depends where everybody's at. They're listening to, how they're listening in. But I mean, fundamentally, I think spend as much time as you can in the wild, in the natural world, and like seek the ones who are orientated to, the guides and the mentors and the trainings and the programs that can, if you're interested in the descent work and the underworld work that can take you there, can guide you there, because we really need guides to go down to the underworld. Like I spent about 7 years of my life in the kind of underworld without having guides, and then when eventually they came along, that was how I was taken through in an initiatory conscious way, and it's in the most life-changing journey you could ever make. So it's really fundamental to seek the elders and seek the initiators, the ones who can really take you through. And, in the meantime, spend time in nature, listen to your dreams, spend time, connecting with your body, connecting with Earth's body, and just let that take you. Let the deep underbelly of your being have space and for you to listen and to take heed and notice.
Gorgeous. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Kate. If listeners would like to find out more about you and your gorgeous work, where's the best place for them to go to do that?
I'm going through a massive redesign at the moment, but currently my current website is silvermoonpoetry.com. So you can find me there, and then you can sign up for my newsletter. And then when my redesign takes its shape, then you'll be well informed. And I'm also on social media through Instagram and Facebook, so you can look me up there. It's Kate Joyner. So yeah, I think those are the best ways.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much, Kate. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne, for having me.
Wasn't that gorgeous? Here are my best bits. We typically pathologise our wounds or our conditions and see them as problems we need to fix, rather than seeing them as an invitation to descend into mythos, to journey into soul and claim the medicine held in our sacred wound. Typically in this culture, when we have a rupture in life, such as a loss, we'll go to therapy or counselling to fix whatever is being driven up in that space. We just don't have the cultural reference for it being a call to the soul. To begin this journey, connect with nature, with your body, listen to your dreams, and find a guide who can accompany you to the underworld. I'd also recommend you listen to last week's show, it was Last All the Everything, which was very, very aligned to this topic about finding ways to connect to soul. I can't remember the episode title. I should have planned this out. I think it was episode 280. I'll just have a quick look for you, actually. Yes, episode 280 for more on the soul. So if you'd like to get notes and links for everything we spoke about this week, hop on over to the show notes, and they're at primalhappiness.co/episode 282. Bit more organized with that one. And if you don't want to miss on next week's episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, or your Android or iOS app of choice and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll get each episode delivered straight to your device as if by magic. And if you want to give back to us and to the show, just share it. just let others know about the gorgeous guests that we have, the amazing wisdom that we explore, the soulful way of living that we're speaking about. Thank you. A huge thanks from my heart for you doing so. I know that this show does get recommended a lot, and it always thrills me. So thank you for doing so. And if you haven't, go share. Thank you. And thank you so much for listening. You've been wonderful. Catch you again next Tuesday.